I was halfway through stacking the last cord of firewood against my garage wall when the weather alert blared from my phone, warning that northern Minnesota was about to get slammed with the worst blizzard we'd seen in 15 years. The forecast predicted 30 inches of snow, winds up to 60 miles per hour, and temperatures dropping to 20 below zero. Living in Duluth, I'd weathered plenty of storms, but this one had everyone nervous. My neighbor Jim had already boarded up his windows, and the grocery stores had been picked clean by lunchtime. I'd spent the better part of 3 days splitting and stacking enough wood to keep my fireplace going for at least 2 weeks, just in case we lost power like we did back in 2019. The wood pile was impressive, I had to admit. 6 feet high, 8 feet long, perfectly stacked against the side of my detached garage where it would stay dry under the overhang. Each piece of oak and maple I'd cut myself from dead trees on my property, split by hand with my grandfather's old axe. It represented hours of backbreaking work, but looking at it gave me a deep sense of satisfaction and security. When the power lines came down, and they would come down, I'd have heat. My 2 dogs, a golden retriever named Biscuit and a German shepherd mix named Tank, would stay warm. That pile wasn't just firewood, it was survival. I should have known that Deborah Vance would find something wrong with it. Deborah was the president of our homeowners association, the Lakeside Heights HOA, and she took her position more seriously than most Supreme Court justices took theirs. She was 53 years old with that classic Karren haircut, the asymmetrical bob that was shorter in the back and longer in the front, dyed an unnatural shade of blonde with dark roots always showing. She wore bedazzled reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had a perpetually pinched expression like she was constantly smelling something unpleasant. In the 3 years since I'd bought my house on Maple Ridge Drive, she'd sent me 17 violation notices for infractions, ranging from my trash cans being visible from the street to my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. The woman had nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations, and she did it with the dedication of a military general inspecting troops. Her white Cadillac Escalade prowled our streets at least twice a day, and she had binoculars in her passenger seat that she didn't even try to hide. Most of the neighbors had learned to just pay the fines and move on, but I'd been fighting her on principle. My property was one of the best maintained on the block. I kept my lawn immaculate, my house painted, my driveway sealed. But Deborah didn't care about any of that. She cared about control. The blizzard hit that evening around 7, and it hit hard. The wind came roaring down from Canada like a freight train, and within an hour, visibility dropped to near zero. Snow piled up so fast that I couldn't see my mailbox from my living room window. The power flickered twice before finally giving up around 9:30, plunging the whole neighborhood into darkness. I'd been prepared for this. I had my fireplace going, candles lit, and enough food to last a week. Biscuit and Tank curled up on the couch next to me while I sat reading by flashlight, listening to the wind howl like a living thing outside. Around midnight, I heard something over the wind. An engine. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, and I could tell it was close. Who in their right mind would be out in this weather? The National Weather Service had issued a travel ban. Even the police had pulled their cruisers off the roads. I got up and pressed my face against the cold window, trying to see through the whiteout conditions. At first, there was nothing but swirling snow, but then I caught a glimpse of headlights in my driveway. My security camera system ran on battery backup, something I'd installed after my neighbor's house got broken into last summer. I pulled up the app on my phone and watched in real time as Deborah's Escalade pulled up to my garage, the massive vehicle lurching through snow that was already past her hubcaps. What was she doing here? Then I watched in absolute disbelief as she got out of the vehicle, bundled in a ridiculous white fur coat that made her look like a Yeti, and started loading my firewood into the back of her SUV. She was stealing my firewood in the middle of a blizzard during a state of emergency. I watched the footage in shock for a solid 30 seconds before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. The woman was making multiple trips, her arms full of the wood I'd spent days preparing, tossing it into her vehicle like it belonged to her. The wind was so strong it kept knocking her sideways, but she persisted with the determination of someone on a mission. I could see her mouth moving, probably cursing, as she slipped and slid on the ice beneath the snow. I grabbed my coat and boots, ready to storm outside and confront her, but then I stopped. If I went out there in these conditions, I could legitimately die. The wind chill was probably 50 below by now, and more importantly, I had her on camera. Every single second was being recorded in crystal clear 4K video with timestamps and everything. Instead of confronting her, I stood at my window and kept watching, recording the screen with my phone as a backup, documenting every load of wood she stole. It took her almost 40 minutes to empty my entire pile. Every single piece. She must have made 20 trips back and forth, and by the end of it, she could barely walk. The woman was exhausted, covered in snow, probably hypothermic, and she'd just stolen approximately $1,200 worth of firewood. When she finally drove away, her taillights disappearing into the white void, I stood there in my dark living room, feeling a mixture of rage and bizarre admiration for her sheer audacity. Tank growled low in his throat, sensing my anger. Biscuit just looked confused, his tail wagging uncertainly. I pulled up the full security footage and watched it again from the beginning, making sure everything was clearly visible. It was perfect. You could see her face, her license plate, her vehicle, every piece of wood she took. The timestamp showed the exact time during a declared state of emergency. This wasn't just theft. This was something more serious. I didn't sleep that night. Part of it was anger. Part of it was worry about staying warm without my wood supply, and part of it was planning exactly how I was going to handle this. I kept my fireplace going with the few pieces of wood I'd kept inside for immediate use, rationing them carefully. The blizzard continued to rage outside, and I watched my security cameras periodically to make sure Deborah didn't come back for an encore performance. By morning, the storm had finally started to ease up. We'd gotten 34 inches according to the news, and the entire city was buried. Duluth was no stranger to snow, but this was extreme even for us. The travel ban remained in effect, and the governor had declared a state of emergency for the entire northern part of Minnesota. My street was impassable, buried under massive drifts that covered cars entirely. The neighbor's sedan looked like an igloo. I spent the morning documenting everything. I took photos of my empty woodpile area, showing the cleared space where it had been. I downloaded all the security footage onto my computer and made 3 backup copies on different drives. I took screenshots of the weather alerts and the travel ban. I even looked up the current laws about theft during a state of emergency and discovered that in Minnesota it could be charged as a felony if the value exceeded $1,000 or if it endangered someone's safety. Both applied here. The power came back on around noon, which was a relief because my house had dropped to 58 degrees inside. I immediately started looking into how much it would cost to replace all that firewood on short notice in the middle of winter, and the quotes I got back were astronomical. One place wanted $1,800 for the same amount, and that was if they could even deliver it, which they couldn't because of the road conditions. Another place was completely sold out. The firewood I'd cut and split myself would cost over $2,000 to replace with delivered wood, assuming I could even find it. That's when I decided to post the video online. I wasn't trying to go viral. I just wanted to document what happened and maybe get some advice from the legal advice subreddit. I edited together the best clips showing Deborah's face clearly, her vehicle, her methodically stealing every piece of wood, all timestamped during the blizzard and travel ban. I posted it with a simple title asking if I had grounds for a police report. Then, I made a sandwich and tried to figure out how I was going to stay warm for the next few days while the city dug itself out. When I checked Reddit an hour later, my post had 3,000 upvotes and over 500 comments. An hour after that, it was at 15,000 upvotes. By evening, it had jumped to 70,000 and had been cross-posted to dozens of other subreddits. People were tagging news stations, lawyers were offering advice in the comments, and someone had already identified Deborah from the video because apparently she was notorious on local Facebook groups for her HOA tyranny. My phone started ringing. The first call was from a local news station asking if they could interview me. Then another station called. Then a newspaper reporter. Then someone from a regional news network. I gave a brief statement to the first reporter who called, a woman named Sarah Chen from Channel 8 News, and told her the basic facts. She asked if she could use the security footage in their broadcast, and I agreed. Why not? It was the truth. That evening, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw two police officers standing on my porch, both of them covered in snow from walking down my unplowed street. I opened the door, and they introduced themselves as Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson from the Duluth Police Department. They'd seen the news report and wanted to get my official statement. We sat in my living room, and I walked them through everything that had happened. I showed them the original footage on my computer, provided them with copies, showed them the empty space where my wood had been, and gave them printouts of the estimates I'd received for replacement firewood. Officer Martinez took notes while Officer Thompson watched the video 3 times, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is one of the more unusual theft cases I've seen," Officer Martinez said, closing her notepad. "But it's pretty cut and dry. We have her on camera, clear identification, proof of value, and it occurred during a state of emergency which elevates the charges. We'll be paying Ms. Vance a visit." "Do you think she still has the wood?" I asked. "I'd be surprised if she's burned through it all in one day," Officer Thompson said. "And even if she has, she's on video taking it. That's all we need." After they left, I checked my phone and saw that the video had been picked up by national news outlets. It was on Twitter with over 1 million views. TikTok had dozens of reaction videos. Someone had made a meme out of a screenshot of Deborah's face as she struggled with an armful of wood, captioning it, "When you're the HOA president and you see a property violation, you can steal." The story had apparently struck a nerve with people who'd had their own nightmares with homeowners associations. My phone kept ringing. More news outlets, a podcast that wanted me as a guest, someone from a late-night talk show asking if I'd be willing to fly to New York for an interview. It was surreal. All I'd wanted was my firewood back, and now I was apparently internet famous. The Reddit post had over 200,000 upvotes and had been gilded 47 times. People were calling Deborah everything from Blizzard Bandit to Firewood Felony Karren. That night, someone knocked on my door around 8. It was my neighbor Jim, carrying an armload of firewood. Behind him were 3 other neighbors, including the Kowalskis from 2 doors down and the elderly Mr. Peterson from across the street. They'd all brought wood from their own supplies. "We saw the news," Jim said, grinning, "and we figured you might need this until you get your wood back or press charges or whatever you're going to do. Nobody on this street likes Deborah. She fined me $300 last year because my fence was 6 inches too tall. She tried to fine us for having a vegetable garden in our front yard," Mrs. Kowalski added. "Said it violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood." We spent the next hour talking on my porch, despite the cold, sharing horror stories about Deborah's HOA reign of terror. Apparently, she'd been president for 6 years, running unopposed because she'd managed to drive away anyone who challenged her authority. She'd instituted increasingly restrictive rules, raised the HOA fees 3 times, and used the money to install elaborate holiday decorations on her own property while claiming they were for the neighborhood. She'd tried to ban certain dog breeds, wanted to require approval for any paint colors, including interior paint, and had attempted to institute a rule requiring all homeowners to use the same landscaping company, which happened to be owned by her nephew. The neighbors left me with enough wood to last a week, refusing to accept any payment. "Just take her down," Mr. Peterson said as he left. "That woman is a menace and somebody needs to stop her." The next morning, I woke up to discover the video had over 10 million views across various platforms. The story was on Good Morning America. A clip played on CNN. My phone had over 300 missed calls and twice as many text messages. Someone had created a GoFundMe to help me buy replacement firewood, and it had already raised $12,000 before I even knew it existed. I immediately posted that I didn't need the money and people should donate to local homeless shelters instead, but the donations kept coming. Around 10 in the morning, I received a certified letter from the Lakeside Heights HOA. Inside was a formal violation notice stating that my firewood pile had been in violation of Section 4.7 of the HOA bylaws, which prohibited unsightly storage of flammable materials visible from public streets. The fine was $800, payable within 30 days, and the notice was dated 2 days before the blizzard. It was signed by Deborah Vance in her capacity as HOA president. I read the letter 3 times, trying to process the logic. She'd issued me a fine for having firewood, then stolen that same firewood during a blizzard, and she thought this letter somehow justified her actions? The document was professionally printed on HOA letterhead with official language and legal references. She'd actually tried to create a paper trail to cover her theft. I scanned the letter and posted it online with a simple caption explaining that I'd just received this in the mail. The internet went ballistic. Lawyers flooded the comments explaining that this actually made things worse for Deborah because it showed premeditation. She'd known about the woodpile, deemed it a violation, and then taken matters into her own hands rather than going through proper channels. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was abuse of authority, possibly criminal intimidation, and definitely grounds for a civil lawsuit. That afternoon, Officer Martinez called me. "We executed a search warrant on Ms. Vance's property this morning," she said. "We found approximately 3/4 of your firewood stacked in her backyard. She'd burned the rest. She's being charged with felony theft, abuse of authority, and reckless endangerment. That last one is because she violated the travel ban during a state of emergency, putting not just herself, but potential emergency responders at risk. She's also facing charges for filing a false police report because when we showed up, she initially claimed you'd given her permission to take the wood." "She said I gave her permission," I asked, incredulous. "She did. Then we showed her the security footage we'd already obtained from you, and she changed her story to say she was confiscating it due to HOA violations. We explained that the HOA doesn't have authority to seize property, and she demanded to speak to our supervisor." I could picture it perfectly. Deborah in her bedazzled glasses, insisting she had the authority to do whatever she wanted because she was the HOA president, completely unable to comprehend that she'd committed actual crimes. "What happens now?" I asked. "She's been arraigned and released on bond. Her court date is set for 6 weeks from now. In the meantime, we've documented the wood at her property, and you're free to retrieve it. We'll need to keep some pieces as evidence, but you can have the vast majority of it back." We took photos and samples. I arranged to pick up my wood that evening. The story of Deborah's arrest made the news within hours, complete with her mugshot, which showed her looking indignant and angry, her Karren haircut slightly disheveled, her mouth open mid-complaint. The mugshot became an instant meme. Someone photoshopped her holding a piece of firewood instead of the standard height card. Another edit showed her surrounded by flames with the caption, "Hot property, HOA, President's career goes up in smoke." When I arrived at Deborah's house with Jim in his truck to collect my wood, there was already a small crowd of neighbors watching from the street. Deborah's house was one of the largest in the neighborhood, a sprawling colonial with white columns and an immaculate lawn that she probably paid a fortune to maintain. Her husband's Mercedes was in the driveway, but I didn't see Deborah's Escalade. Officer Thompson was there to supervise the wood retrieval and make sure there were no confrontations. As we were loading the last of the wood into Jim's truck, Deborah's front door flew open. She stood in the doorway, wearing a silk robe and those ridiculous bedazzled glasses, her face red with fury. "You have destroyed my reputation!" she screamed at me across her lawn. "I'm being dragged through the mud by the entire internet because of you. I have been getting death threats. My daughter can't go to school because people recognize her. This is all your fault." Officer Thompson immediately stepped between us. "Ms. Vance, I'm going to need you to go back inside. You're not supposed to have any contact with Mr. Quinn." "Contact? He's on my property stealing my firewood." "This is his firewood," Officer Thompson said calmly. "As we've explained multiple times, you took it from his property during the blizzard. We have it on video. We've been through this." "That wood was an HOA violation," Deborah shrieked. "I had every right to confiscate it. The bylaws clearly state that unsightly storage is prohibited." "The HOA doesn't have the legal authority to seize personal property," Officer Thompson repeated, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Even if something violates HOA rules, which is debatable, the remedy is fines or legal action, not taking someone's belongings. We've explained this to you and your lawyer." A man appeared behind Deborah, putting his hand on her shoulder. This must have been her husband, Richard. He looked exhausted, like he'd aged 10 years in 2 days. "Deb, please, just come inside. You're making it worse." "Worse? Worse? How could it possibly be worse than it already is?" She turned her fury on him. "This is all because you wouldn't let me cut down our oak trees for firewood. I told you we needed wood for the blizzard, and you said it was too expensive to have them cut, so I had to improvise." The small crowd of neighbors was recording this on their phones. I could see the video would be online within minutes. Deborah's husband clearly realized this too because his face went pale. He physically pulled her back inside and shut the door. We could hear her still yelling inside the house. Jim and I finished loading the wood in uncomfortable silence. As we drove away, I saw curtains twitching in windows all down the street. Everyone had watched that confrontation. Deborah's claim that she'd taken my wood because her husband wouldn't pay to cut down their trees for firewood was going to be the final nail in her coffin. She hadn't even pretended it was about HOA enforcement. She'd admitted she took it because she wanted it for herself. That evening, the video of Deborah's front yard meltdown went as viral as the original theft footage. News stations played it with the audio bleeped because she'd used quite a bit of profanity. Legal analysts on cable news discussed how she'd essentially confessed to theft on camera, destroying any possible defense her lawyer might have tried to construct. One commentator called it possibly the most self-incriminating rant since the guy who live streamed himself participating in a crime. Over the next few days, things escalated in ways I never could have predicted. An emergency HOA meeting was called by a coalition of homeowners who wanted Deborah removed as president. The meeting was held at the community center, and over 200 people showed up. This was significant because the entire neighborhood only had about 300 homes. I attended, sitting in the back with Jim and the Kowalskis, watching as homeowner after homeowner stood up to share their complaints about Deborah's leadership. One woman testified that Deborah had fined her $2,000 over the course of a year for violations that included having the wrong shade of white paint on her shutters, keeping her trash cans visible for 20 minutes past the allowed time, and parking her own car in her own driveway overnight instead of in her garage. A man explained that Deborah had threatened to put a lien on his house because he'd planted rose bushes without HOA approval, even though there was nothing in the bylaws about landscaping requiring approval. Another couple described how Deborah had tried to force them to remove their wheelchair ramp because it was aesthetically displeasing, despite the fact that their teenage son was paralyzed and needed it. The stories went on for 3 hours. Deborah wasn't present at the meeting, presumably on advice from her lawyer, but her husband Richard was there. He sat in the front row, his head in his hands, as person after person described the ways his wife had made their lives miserable. When it came time to vote on removing her as president, the result was unanimous except for 2 abstentions. Deborah was out. The next item on the agenda was reviewing all the fines Deborah had issued over the past year. A lawyer who lived in the neighborhood, Kenneth Quarles, volunteered to go through them and determine which were legitimate according to the actual bylaws versus which were Deborah's personal interpretations or outright inventions. He estimated it would take him a few weeks, but he suspected that at least 60% of the fines she'd issued had no legal basis. I went home that night feeling vindicated, but also a bit sad. As much as Deborah had been a nightmare, watching her entire life implode over Firewood was almost tragic. Almost. Then I remembered how she'd shrieked at me for destroying her reputation, taking no responsibility for her own actions, and the sympathy evaporated. The criminal case moved forward. Deborah's lawyer tried to get the charges reduced, arguing that it was a civil HOA dispute that had been blown out of proportion by social media. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Diana Vaughn, who I met with twice to go over my testimony, wasn't having it. She explained to me that they were taking the case seriously because it represented a pattern of abuse of authority that needed to be addressed. HOA presidents aren't dictators, Diana said during our second meeting. They have specific powers granted by the bylaws, and those powers don't include seizing property or violating the law. Ms. Vance seems to have forgotten that, and the state of emergency aspect makes this more serious. If we let people violate travel bans to steal things whenever they feel entitled to them, it sets a dangerous precedent. 6 weeks after the blizzard, I sat in a courtroom in downtown Duluth watching Deborah Vance stand trial. The courthouse was packed with spectators, many of them from our neighborhood, and there were reporters from at least a dozen news outlets. The case had maintained its viral status, with regular updates being shared across social media. Someone had even created a hashtag, Blizzard Bandit, that trended periodically whenever there was news. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They showed the security footage, which was damning in its clarity. They presented evidence of the travel ban and state of emergency declarations. They had the wood itself, samples of which were presented as evidence with my testimony that it matched the wood I'd cut and stacked. They showed the HOA violation letter that Deborah had sent, demonstrating premeditation. And they played the video of Deborah's front yard confession, where she'd admitted taking the wood because her husband wouldn't provide firewood for their own use. Deborah's defense attorney, a tired-looking man who seemed to know he was fighting a losing battle, tried to argue that it was a misunderstanding. He claimed Deborah had genuinely believed she had authority to remove items that violated HOA rules, that she'd intended to store the wood temporarily and return it after the storm, and that she'd panicked during the confrontation outside her house, leading to her unfortunate word choices. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution tore it apart. If she'd intended to return the wood, why did she burn a quarter of it? If she genuinely believed it was an HOA issue, why did she later admit she took it for her own use? If it was all a misunderstanding, why did she lie to police initially and claim I'd given her permission? I testified for about an hour, explaining what had happened in chronological order. Deborah's lawyer tried to trip me up during cross-examination, suggesting I'd left the wood out deliberately to provoke her, but it didn't work. I'd stacked the wood against my garage, on my property, exactly where firewood is typically stored. There was nothing provocative about it. The trial lasted 3 days. On the afternoon of the third day, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts: felony theft, abuse of authority, and reckless endangerment. Deborah's face turned white when the verdict was read. Her husband, sitting behind her in the gallery, closed his eyes and seemed to deflate. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the civil cases started. Kenneth Quarles, the lawyer from the neighborhood, had completed his review of Deborah's fines and determined that 73 of the 112 fines she'd issued in the past 2 years were not supported by the actual HOA bylaws. He filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all affected homeowners, seeking return of illegally collected fines plus damages for harassment and emotional distress. The HOA itself also sued Deborah, claiming she'd exceeded her authority and damaged the organization's reputation, exposing them to liability. Her actions had caused home values in the neighborhood to drop slightly, because nobody wanted to move to that neighborhood with the crazy HOA president. Several pending home sales had fallen through after buyers looked up the neighborhood online and found thousands of articles about the firewood theft. I received a formal apology from the new HOA president, a reasonable man named Keith Quinlan, who owned the hardware store downtown. He explained that they were revising all the bylaws to add more oversight and prevent any one person from having as much unilateral authority as Deborah had wielded. They were also instituting term limits and creating an appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly fined. What she did was inexcusable, Keith said when we met for coffee at a local diner. And honestly, a lot of us knew she was out of control, but nobody wanted the hassle of challenging her. She'd threatened legal action against anyone who questioned her, and most people just wanted to keep their heads down. We should have stopped her years ago. The day of Deborah's sentencing arrived in early March. The blizzard was long past, and spring was starting to peek through the lingering snow. I attended the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because I wanted to see the conclusion of this bizarre chapter of my life. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial, but there were still plenty of spectators and reporters. Deborah stood before the judge, looking diminished somehow. She'd lost weight, and her trademark bedazzled glasses were gone, replaced with simple wire-framed ones. Her lawyer made a brief statement asking for leniency, pointing out that she had no prior criminal record and had already suffered significant consequences, including loss of her position, damage to her reputation, and the stress of multiple lawsuits. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Patricia Morrison, was not sympathetic. Ms. Vance, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust repeatedly and flagrantly. The theft of Mr. Quinn's firewood during a state of emergency while traveling in violation of a lawful ban demonstrates a shocking level of entitlement and disregard for both the law and the safety of others. Your subsequent attempts to justify your actions and your harassment of the victim show a lack of remorse that troubles this court greatly. Judge Morrison sentenced Deborah to 18 months in prison with the possibility of parole after 6 months. She also ordered restitution of $1,800 to cover the replacement cost of my firewood, plus $5,000 in punitive damages. Deborah would be required to perform 300 hours of community service after her release, and she was permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position in the state of Minnesota. Deborah sobbed as she was led away in handcuffs. Her husband sat motionless in the gallery, staring straight ahead. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions watching her go. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow somehow. A woman's life was ruined over firewood. Then again, it wasn't really about firewood. It was about years of petty tyranny, abuse of power, and a fundamental inability to see other people as anything but subjects to be controlled. The civil lawsuit settled over the following months. Deborah's homeowner's insurance actually covered some of the liability, though they fought it initially claiming it wasn't a covered event. The class action lawsuit resulted in all illegally collected fines being returned with interest, totaling over $47,000 distributed among 38 homeowners. The HOA's lawsuit against Deborah resulted in her being permanently banned from any HOA activities and required to pay for the legal review and revision of all neighborhood bylaws. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The viral videos eventually faded from the internet's collective attention, replaced by new outrages and scandals. I still get recognized occasionally, usually at the grocery store or gas station, by people who want to tell me their own HOA horror stories. The neighborhood has been peaceful under Keith's leadership. The bylaws are more reasonable now, the fines are proportional and justified, and there's actual democratic oversight instead of one person ruling like a feudal lord. I replaced the firewood that Deborah had burned with the money from the restitution, and I stacked it in exactly the same spot against my garage. Nobody said a word about it being a violation. In fact, several neighbors started keeping firewood in their own yards, a small act of solidarity that made me smile every time I noticed it. Jim and I became good friends through all of this. We get together every couple of weeks for beers and to watch hockey, and he never fails to make at least one firewood joke. Mr. Peterson checks on me regularly to make sure I'm stocked up for winter. The Kowalskis expanded their front yard vegetable garden and now grow enough produce to share with half the street with no complaints from anyone. About 8 months after the sentencing, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Deborah, written from the county jail where she was serving her sentence. The letter was surprisingly lucid and self-aware, which caught me off guard. She apologized for what she'd done, explaining that she'd been in therapy and had come to realize she'd been using the HOA presidency as a way to exert control in her life because she felt powerless in other areas. Her marriage had been struggling. Her adult children barely spoke to her, and she'd poured all her energy into the neighborhood because it was something she could manage and regulate. She didn't make excuses exactly, but she tried to explain her mindset. She'd convinced herself that she was making the neighborhood better, that her strict enforcement was raising property values and maintaining standards. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, even as she became more and more authoritarian. The firewood theft, she wrote, had been a breaking point. She'd been furious that I'd ignored her violation notice, furious that her husband had refused to get firewood for their own use, and she'd snapped. In her mind at that moment, she'd had the authority to do whatever she deemed necessary. The letter ended with another apology and a request that I not respond. She said she was writing to take accountability, not to ask for forgiveness or sympathy. She would serve her time, pay her debts, and then try to rebuild some kind of life away from HOAs and positions of authority over others. She hoped I could move on from what had happened and wished me well. I read the letter several times, then filed it away in a drawer. I appreciated the apology, and I did believe it was genuine, but it didn't change anything. The damage had been done, not just to me, but to dozens of neighbors she'd harassed over the years. Still, I hoped she meant what she said about therapy and change. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even HOA Karens who steal firewood during blizzards. That winter came and went without incident. I kept my firewood stocked and used it regularly to supplement my heating. The pile never got stolen again, and I never received another violation notice. The security cameras stayed up, though, because I'd learned that documentation is everything. You never know when you might need proof of what really happened. Sometimes on quiet evenings when I'm sitting by my fireplace with biscuit and tank curled up nearby, wood crackling and radiating warmth, I think about that night during the blizzard when I watched Deborah steal my firewood. It was such a bizarre, audacious act, and it changed everything. It exposed years of petty tyranny, led to systemic reform in our neighborhood, and somehow became a viral internet moment that resonated with millions of people who'd had their own battles with HOA authorities. The firewood represented more than just fuel for heat. It represented self-sufficiency, preparation, and the fruits of hard labor. When Deborah took it, she wasn't just stealing property. She was stealing security and peace of mind during an emergency. That's what made people so angry about it. Everyone understood on a visceral level how wrong it was, how entitled and cruel you'd have to be to do something like that. The legal system worked the way it was supposed to in this case. Deborah was held accountable, victims received restitution, and reforms were implemented to prevent future abuses. It didn't always work out that neatly, I knew that. But in this instance, justice actually prevailed, and that was satisfying in a deep and fundamental way. The neighborhood has thrived in the aftermath. Property values recovered once the news cycle moved on. New families moved in and found a welcoming community with reasonable rules and fair enforcement. The Facebook groups that used to be full of complaints about Deborah's latest outrage now share recipes, organize block parties, and help each other out when someone needs a hand. Keith Quinlan proved to be an excellent HOA president, and when his term ended, a retired teacher named Dorothy Vale took over and continued the positive changes. The organization functions now as it was supposed to, maintaining common areas and handling legitimate issues without harassment or overreach. It turns out that when you treat people with respect and apply rules fairly, everyone gets along much better. I never did take down my security cameras, and I've actually upgraded them twice since the incident. The footage has come in handy a few more times, though nothing as dramatic as the firewood theft. Once I caught a package thief and was able to give police clear images that led to an arrest. Another time I was able to prove that a delivery company had damaged my fence and tried to deny it. Documentation matters. The whole experience taught me several important lessons. First, always document everything, because you never know when you might need evidence of what really happened. Second, standing up to petty tyrants is worth it, even when it's exhausting and stressful. Third, communities are stronger than any individual bully, and when people come together, they can create real change. And finally, never underestimate the power of the internet to hold people accountable when traditional systems fail. My minor internet fame faded quickly, which was fine with me. I never wanted to be known as the firewood guy, even though that's how some people still recognize me. What I wanted was justice, accountability, and peace in my neighborhood, and I got all three. The story had a good ending, which is more than most HOA horror stories can claim. Jim still brings up the whole incident whenever we have new neighbors move in, telling the story with increasing embellishment each time. In his latest version, Deborah drove a tank through my yard and stole enough wood to build an ark. I just roll my eyes and let him entertain people. It's a good story, and it has the advantage of being essentially true, even if Jim's details get more creative with each telling. Deborah was released from jail after serving 7 months of her 18-month sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and Richard moved away, somewhere warmer and far from Minnesota. I hope she found peace and got the help she clearly needed. I hold no grudge against her anymore. Life's too short for that kind of weight. The firewood pile against my garage has become something of a neighborhood landmark. People point it out to visitors, telling the story of the infamous theft in the viral video that followed. I've thought about moving it just to avoid the attention, but ultimately, I keep it there because that's where firewood should be. Practical, accessible, and properly stacked. I'm not going to change how I do things because of what happened. That would be letting Deborah win, in a way. Every time there's a winter storm warning now, at least 3 neighbors text me to make sure my woodpile is secure and to joke about whether anyone is trying to steal it. It's become a running gag in the neighborhood, and I don't mind the humor. Sometimes you have to laugh at the absurdity of life, and few things are more absurd than an HOA president stealing firewood during a blizzard and having it documented in 4K video. The case still occasionally comes up in legal discussions about HOA overreach and the importance of having clear limitations on HOA authority. Law schools have apparently used it as an example in property law courses. That both amuses and disturbs me. My petty neighborhood drama became a cautionary tale for future lawyers about what happens when HOAs become too powerful and leaders become too entitled. Looking back now, nearly 2 years after that blizzard night, I can see how the whole incident was a perfect storm of circumstances. Deborah's escalating power trips, my refusal to be intimidated, the timing of the blizzard and travel ban, the security cameras capturing everything clearly, and the internet's appetite for exactly this kind of story all converged at the right moment. If any one element had been different, the outcome would have changed completely. But it happened the way it happened, and I'm at peace with it all. I got my firewood back. Deborah faced consequences for her actions, the neighborhood improved dramatically, and I learned valuable lessons about documentation, justice, and community. My dogs are warm every winter, my house is heated, and I can sit by my fireplace knowing that the wood crackling in the flames is mine, honestly obtained and legally protected. The security camera footage that went viral has been viewed over 30 million times across all platforms at this point. Someone made a documentary short film about it that played at a film festival. A comedian did a bit about it on a late-night show. It became one of those cultural moments that far exceeded the actual incident, taking on a life of its own in the collective consciousness. But for me, it will always just be the night some woman stole my firewood during a blizzard, got caught on camera, and faced the consequences. Simple as that. The fact that millions of people found it compelling just shows how universal the frustration with petty authorities really is. Everyone has dealt with someone like Deborah at some point, whether in an HOA, a workplace, a school board, or any other organization where a little bit of power goes to someone's head. I still live in the same house, on the same street, in the same neighborhood. I still stack my firewood in the same spot every autumn. I still maintain my property to high standards, not because anyone is forcing me to, but because I take pride in my home. And every winter when the first big snow falls and I'm sitting warm inside watching the flakes accumulate, I think about that blizzard night and smile. Sometimes the good guys win. Sometimes justice actually works. Sometimes standing up to bullies pays off. And sometimes, just sometimes, the whole world watches when a HOA Karren takes things too far and gets exactly what she deserves. That's the real lesson from all of this. Do the right thing, document everything, stand your ground, and let the chips fall where they may. The truth has a way of coming out, especially when you have it recorded in 4K with timestamps and perfect lighting. Life goes on in Duluth, Minnesota. The winters are still brutal, the snow still falls in feet rather than inches, and firewood remains a valuable commodity when the power lines come down. But in our little corner of Lakeside Heights, things are different now. Better. People look out for each other, the rules are fair and evenly applied, and nobody lives in fear of petty fines from an authoritarian HOA president. That's worth more than any viral video or moment of internet fame. That's real, lasting change that improves daily life for everyone involved. And that pile of firewood sitting against my garage? It's not just fuel anymore. It's a symbol of standing up for yourself, of communities coming together, and of the simple fact that theft is theft, no matter who does it or what justification they think they have. The wood keeps me warm, but the principle keeps me smiling. Justice was served, one piece of firewood at a time.